Well, welcome back to the channel, everybody. Hope you're having a great day so far. Hey, based on one of the previous videos that I uploaded a week or two ago on some weathering I did on, well, it was 6 different freight cars, but included in that was some coil cars. Got a couple comments from folks asking if I would do a video on how I weathered the coil cars, should I happen to do any in the future, and it just fate had it that I have several of these that I need to do. So I'm going to be using Mission Models acrylics today. Some highway yellow, some standard rust, some basic white, and that larger container is just thinner. The acrylics are going to allow me to do this project pretty quick. Not a lot of dry time. In fact, using the airbrush, they're going to dry almost instantaneously, which will allow us to go step to step pretty quick. What I'm doing here is I'm creating a custom faded orange in the airbrush, and I'm just mixing it up in the cup itself. Not trying to get anything specific, doesn't have to be perfect. This sort of pale, almost rusty orange is going to be my fade coat. It's just going to give me that sun bleached effect, and there's no precision involved in this portion. All I'm going to be doing is putting a gentle fade on the entire upper portion of the coil covers, with a focus on the horizontal surfaces across the top and the standoffs that are going to get a lot of rust and fade damage just from being used in service. So you can see me just putting that fade coat on, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. I'm not trying to go for 100% perfect coverage. You want that color variation. But I'm also using this to hit the bottom in the trucks. Now what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to use some dark rust, and I'm going to pour that right into my mixing cup. Instead of going straight with the dark rust, by adding it to what's left over from my initial mix, that creates a nice transition color so that there's not so much contrast and harshness as I go from color to color. Now, what I'm going to do with this, you're going to see here in a second as I start to paint the model, is this is going to be a little bit more of a detail. It's still not super detailed, but this is going to be a little bit more of a detailed application. So I'm starting to focus on where my deeper rust marks, and I guess that would be more aged rust. As rust ages, it'll start to take on a darker coloration. It almost becomes a brownish black color as it oxidizes over time. So what I'm focusing on in the areas that would have initially started rusting first and have since been rusting for a longer period of time, if that makes sense. So we're creating some of that depth to the rust marks. And the nice thing about this, I'm also going to be using this color extensively on the undercarriage, the underside of the chassis, the couplers, the trucks. And this is going to start forming my initial base coats for the weathering on the lower portion of the model. Starting to do the kick-ups marks on the ends, the freight car ends, where the debris and, well, not debris, but wash and kick up and spray would happen as the car rolls down the track. Another thing that I like to point out is if you're doing these coil cars and they have removable pieces, don't forget the inner portions of the coil cars. You want to make sure that you get some dust and grime on those. It would look really weird if you pull the coils off and those inner portions are completely perfect and unweathered. That would never be the case in real life. So adding some weathering to those inner portions and giving it all a look. The airbrush I'm using is just a relatively inexpensive TimberTech all-in-one unit. You can hear the compressor turn on as I air it up. Now from here, what I'm doing is I'm going to rail tie brown. So this is almost a blackish brown, and I'm going to just put that straight into the cup again with the existing mixture that's already in there and mix that up. Now this is going to start to create my darkest, almost my darkest portion. And I'll show you what that looks like here. It's almost like a grayish brown, and needed to add a little bit more thinner here because it was a little bit too thick. Don't want this stuff to gum up in the airbrush nozzle. So just mixing it up, and I really like that color. It's got a really nice grimy, rusty color. Now, this is where I'm really going to start focusing on just applying color to the inner portions of the rust marks that we've already created. I'd like to point out that as the model stands now, you could put this on your layout and it would look just fine. But I want to go for a little bit more depth of the rust effects. So what we're doing is we're looking at the places where you'd have welded plate coming together. That stuff seems to rust a little bit earlier than the flat portions. So we're just really focusing on the inner portions of those rust marks. Give them some really nice depth. And getting the trucks and the undercarriage, the couplers, kick up, road spray, just that grime on the bottom. No wrong way to do this. If you make a mistake, you just come back in with a Q-tip and some alcohol and it'll wipe right off. But to be honest with you, as I make mistakes, I usually just run with them, right? Mother Nature doesn't follow a formula. Mother Nature does some pretty random stuff. So the more random you can make it, the better it's going to look in the end. Just kind of giving it a once over, hitting those trucks. Now when I paint the trucks, you can see this is literally the third coat of paint I've put on the trucks at this point. So I'm not trying to get perfect coverage. I'm just going for a light film, and those film layers build up and create a really nice, they'll be very flat, but it creates a really nice depth because you don't have like a solid color coat. Now what I did here, I poured out what was in the cup into my little tray down there in the bottom of the screen, and now I'm just coming back in with almost a straight rail tie brown. So this is going to be the darkest of all the colors, and I needed it to be a little bit darker. That's why I poured out what was mixed in there. Now I'm not going to waste any paint. It's all going to get reused. It's going to get poured back in, but this is just some straight rail tie brown. Now this is going to be very, very focused. So this is going to be right in the middle of those rust marks. And I'm just going for the deepest, kind of most aged rust, if you will, in those spots. But I'm also using this color as like a grime coat, a really nice, gentle grime coat on the underside of the freight car. Because everything's black down here, the black takes these darker browns really nice for weathering and dust and kick up and stuff like that. But as you can see, I'm just going in and really highlighting kind of the centralized portions of those rust spots that we're creating along the edges, places that would get scratched and nicked up, where we just kind of see the oldest rust, if you will. No rush here. Just to give you guys some idea, this entire process took less than 2 hours. So from start to finish, I got this one done in under 2 hours. And primarily that was because I used the acrylics, the airbrush acrylics. It allows you to cover a lot of ground and do it really quickly. Not worried about overspray on my wheels because I'll use some alcohol on the flanges to clean those off. But what I'm doing now is I'm going in with the straight rail tie brown, since I had it in my airbrush cup, and I'm painting the dishes of the wheels. I don't show it, but at the end what I'll do is I go in with some straight alcohol and a paintbrush, and I just clean off the flanges with the paintbrush and the 90% alcohol, and I just used a Q-tip to do that. Now I poured all my excess paint, I cleaned out my airbrush, poured all my excess paint into my tray down below. This is a fine tip 20/0 brush. You can get these at any high quality paint store or art store. I buy most of my higher end brushes from Dick Blick. Funny name for a store, but any artist store is going to have these brushes. You need some fine tip brushes, and I have probably 6 or 7. But this is my go-to brush for actual detailing. So all I'm doing now is I'm taking that mixture of paint that I had in my airbrush cup that I poured into my tray there, and I'm just highlighting the actual rust marks themselves. And in doing so, what I'm doing is I'm creating a lot of depth in those spots. You can see as the acrylics dry, they kind of fade out a little bit, which is nice. It gives you a really nice gradual effect. And I think what really brings these cars to life is you just start putting some random nicks and scrapes and scratches in them. If you want to use a little bit of like a grimy black or a gray down towards the bottom of the car, that could be some kick up from going down the rails, from being in a yard or being around a steel facility or something along those lines. But this might seem kind of tedious what I'm doing right here, but believe it or not, this actually goes very fast. I was able to do the entire car probably in terms of these little acrylic scrapes and dings and dents and just early rust formation spots. I was probably able to get the entirety of the car done in less than 15 minutes. It goes pretty quick. And the key here is not to overdo it. It's got to be random or it'll start to look kind of strange. But, your eye will tell you what looks good and just let the brush do the work. You don't need a lot of paint on the brush. Gentle touches. Focus on the edges, areas where there be welds, things along those lines. And the effect will be real nice. Don't forget the ends of the cars. Just a little bit here or there, and it really goes a long way. It'll give you a really believable look. Now, done with the acrylics, we're moving to oils. I use burnt sienna, burnt umber, and raw umber. Now, that's what I put on the napkin in the back. Before I started the project, I put my little blobs of paint on that napkin so the oil would draw out of the paint. So that's raw umber, burnt umber, and raw sienna. Turns out I didn't use the raw sienna on this project, so I wasted some paint. The raw sienna has a very reddish tint to it, so you got to use it. I usually like to mix it with the burnt umber, but we're just going to put some burnt umber and raw umber kind of light blobs in the centers or the upper portions of these rust patches right now. And what we're doing, and there's no rush here because it takes a while for this oil paint to dry. Now, if you've allowed the oil to leach off into the cloth, like you must do, or else the oil paints will never dry. You have plenty of time to work with this stuff, but because my oil paint had been sitting on that napkin for about 45 minutes, pretty much what I'm putting on here is straight oil-based pigment. So, don't want to leave it there for 2 or 3 hours, but there's no concern about how fast this is going to dry. I like to do one portion of the car at a time so I don't forget a spot and leave a blob of oil paint sitting on something. But that's all I'm doing. I'm putting the oil paint in the middle of the actual rust marks or towards the top. In some cases, I'm just putting a little dot of it on some of the acrylic rust nicks that I've made, and I'll stretch that pigment out with a grainer brush here in just a second, show you what that looks like. So here's the grainer brush. That's a 1/4 inch grainer brush, Princeton brand. I love this brush. It's my favorite brush in my entire arsenal of brushes. But just dipping it in some odorless mineral spirits. And all we're going to do is we're going to draw that oil-based pigment straight down. Real important to go in perfect vertical strokes. And all we're doing is gently drawing that down. And you'll get a feel for how much thinner you need to use. Now, because this pigment has very little oil left in it, it's really allowing me to go over it several times. If you have too much oil in the pigment, it's gonna just almost mix right on your painting surface. So you'll get a feel for it. Can't really mess it up. If you draw too much of it off, you just put a little more on. If it doesn't want to work with you, you just keep gently pulling it until you get the effect you're after. And the one thing I will say is, as you go over the edges there, it's going to leave a little bit behind, and that won't look natural. So you do have to go back in and kind of touch that up. And again, you need to keep the strokes vertical, or it will not look right. If you go horizontal with this stuff, it looks real amateur. So keep them nice and vertical. Steady hand as best you can. If you need to kind of brace your hand with your other hand to keep it steady, do that. See that little blob right there? I'm just kind of vertically pulling that back up. And if there's enough thinner or mineral spirits on the surface, it's going to do a nice kind of blend effect naturally. Gravity's going to pull that pigment down towards the bottom anyway. But the last thing you want is to be left with a sort of wet drip looking spot, which will happen if you're not careful. If you use too much pigment and don't pull it off. This is probably the most satisfying part of any weathering project, because once you start to get some of that rust work really popping, it really kind of comes to life and looks real. Key here is not to overdo it. You'd be surprised if you watch trains go by, there's not as many rust buckets rolling down the rails as you might expect. Now, if you're modeling sort of the bankruptcy era, the late 60s, early 70s, when many railroads were failing, maybe you do want a lot of rusty cars. But typically what you see is dust and grime. If you're running the steam era, a lot of soot and stuff like that. These colorful cars really lend themselves nicely to rust and scratches and stuff, because they really kind of pop. Now, if you have oxide red or boxcar red rolling stock, there's a reason the railroads paint them that colors, because they hide rust and grime real well. So some different techniques if you want to make rust pop on those. You really need to fade them and lighten them so that the rust kind of stands out. But as you can see here, I'm just taking my time and going over those places that I applied the raw umber and burnt umber pigments. And I'm just stretching them down to the point that I think they look natural. And that the mineral spirits will evaporate and kind of flash off and dry on their own. The nice thing about the oil paints is when the oils dry, they are very, very flat, but they're somewhat transparent. So they put a nice gentle film over everything. They really look nice. And this is kind of what it looks like after stretching all the oil paints over the unit are. I went back in and on the air valves and trucks in the couplers put a light coat, a light wash of the oil paints, just to really flatten those guys out. Kind of give you an idea what the other side looks like. You can see the mineral spirits are already starting to dry, and this is literally right after I finished stretching out the paint. I pretty much let that dry for a couple hours and then dull coated it with some Tester's dull coat, and this is what the finished result looks like. I also patched out an MTH Pensy coil car you see in the background there and converted it into our Lake Erie and Midwestern reporting marks. Like the way that one turned out, you can see how a lot of the rust effects kind of are muted on an oxide red car. But that's kind of what the finished product looks like. And you can do this in less than 2 hours, an entire car. Obviously less time if you want less rust effects. But both of these projects were really fun. Can't wait to get on the railroad. That is a kind of a quick snapshot of all the colors. That's all the paint that was used. just the Mission Models colors and some oil-based paints. But yeah, I appreciate you guys visiting with us. Hope this was a helpful video for you, and you can take something out of this for your railroad. Alrighty, guys. Happy railroad. Take care.